Sir Kannan Gopalakrishnan. He was working as a senior architect at Engineering Design Research Centre, L&T Construction, India's largest construction company. He's also worked on projects ranging from institutional buildings to international airports, apartment complexes to aircraft hangars. He's also attended 3 international conferences and 2 national conferences, and has also presented technical papers at the Jawaharlal Nehru University, Delhi, and the MSRIT, Bangalore. He's also won the national championship at Archaman at the India's largest architecture quiz. Sir Kannan Gopalakrishnan currently runs a design firm, Habitat Design Studio, and he is also a visiting faculty at the renowned architecture schools in Tamil Nadu.
Welcome back to UGC lecture series. This is AR 6502 History of Architecture and Culture. We are dealing with Unit 1, wherein we are looking at leading to a new architecture. We are in lecture 3, but in lecture 2, if you could remember, previously we saw how and why do we study history, the reasons behind it. We saw the beginnings of modernity, saw the differences between modernism and modernity, and we learnt about the age of enlightenment. We also saw neoclassicism, the basic evolution and its key proponents in England and in France. Today in this episode, we will be looking at neoclassicism in detail, its types and what structural neoclassicism is, and we will be looking at some of the works of great architects Laugier and Soufflot. Neoclassicism types. In the middle of the 19th century, we saw the neoclassical heritage divided between 2 closely related developments. One is the structural classicism of Labruzze and the romantic classicism of Schinkel. The structural classicists tended to emphasize the structure, the line of Cordemoy, Laugier and Soufflot. These were the people who emphasized on structural classicism, whereas the romantic classicists stressed on the form of the line of Ledoux, Boulle and Gilly. One school concentrated on such types as prisoners, hospitals, railway stations, while the other school focused on representational structures such as universities and museums. These were the basic differences between structural neoclassists and romantic neoclassists. Today we will be looking at structural neoclassists, the first one being Marc Antony Laugier. Marc Antony Laugier lived between 1713 and 1769, was a Jesuit priest and architectural theorist. He was born in Manosque province. Laugier is better known for his essay on architecture published in 1753. In 1755, he published a second edition with the famous, often reproduced illustration of a primitive hut. His approach is to discuss some familiar aspects of Renaissance and post-Renaissance architectural practice, which he describes as faults. These faults induce his commentary on columns, the entablature and on pediments. Essai sur l'architecture, frontispiece by Charles Dominic Joseph Eisen. Among faults he lists for columns are that of being engaged in the wall, the use of pilasters, incorrect ensasses and the setting of columns on pedestals. Being embedded in the wall detracts from the overall beauty and aesthetic nature of columns, he says. Laugier states that the columns should be free. Laugier calls certain elements which we follow as faults. The basic faults which he talks about are, he talks about columns which are being engaged with the wall. He thinks that columns should not be a part of the wall. Pilasters are wrong. He thinks that columns should be away from the wall. Columns are freestanding structures according to Laugier. And he also is advocating against the incorrect use of entasis. Entasis is a property wherein you bulge the column in the middle so that the column appears as an even line for your eyes, because the Greeks used entasis as a optical correction methodology in their buildings. Often their buildings are not exactly rectangles, they are actually little skewed and a little bulged on the side and the middle and all, so that it appears as if it's a perfect rectangle from a distance. So, Greeks used it extensively well. So, Loggia insists on being against incorrect entasis. Marc Antony Loggia outlined his theory about architecture in the 1753 Essai sur l'architecture. According to Loggia, all architecture derives from these three essential primitive elements, the three elements being the column, the entablature and the pediment. Loggia explained his book-length essay in a second edition published in 1755. This second edition includes the iconic frontispiece illustration by French artist Charles Eyssin. In the picture, an idyllic woman, perhaps the personification of architecture herself, points out a simple rustic cabin to a child, perhaps the unknown naive architect. Let us take a look at the picture. Here in this picture, there is a simple idealistic woman who is sitting and she is pointing at a hut to this child. It is personified that this lady here is mother architecture herself, and this child is a beginner, a naive architect. By showing him the primitive hut, which looked like columns and pediments and all the three parameters which Loggia thought was basic in any building, he thought the columns, the entablature and the pediment as the three basic requirements in any building. Here you see he was shown a primitive hut, and then he immediately looks at the primitive hut as columns, entablature and the pediment. This is how an architect simply deciphers the basic layouts of even something as primitive as a hut. The structure she points to is simplistic in design, uses the basic geometric shapes and it's constructed from natural elements. Loggia's primitive hut is his representation of the philosophy that all architecture derives from this simple ideal. An essay on architecture in which its true principles are explained are invariable rules proposed for directing the judgment and forming the taste of the gentleman and the architect with regard to the different kinds of buildings, the embellishment of cities and the planning of gardens. The note is self-explanatory, in which he tries to explain all the invariable rules which he is proposing, all judgment which he is directing, which forms the taste for the gentleman who is the architect with regards to the building, cities and gardens which the architect is planning. Let us take a moment here and discuss why Loggia's primitive hut is very important. The essay is considered as a major treatise on architectural theory. It is often cited by teachers of architecture and practicing architects even in the 21st century. Loggia's expression is pro-Greek classicism and reacts against the Baroque ornamentation and decoration of his day. It established the argument for future architectural movements, including the 18th century neoclassicism and 21st century trend towards unadorned, eco-friendly tiny homes and small dwellings. The primitive hut is very important because Loggia states that anything in architecture, the column, the pediment and the entablature, starting from that to every single thing that man has produced so far, every single thing that mankind has produced so far is from this basic concept of a primitive hut. Man learnt how to build structures and from there he derived the principles, and according to him it is a very formal nature of expression, but even today it is relevant because today we are going back to building eco-friendly houses made of natural materials. Today we are looking at very less ornamentation in our buildings and ornamentation which are barely necessary. Today we are looking at space optimization. Today, as our population is exploding, we are looking at tiny homes and small dwellings, spaces that are less in size and more in utility. As we are moving towards this kind of architecture, Loggia's primitive hut is very important for us to understand. The primitive hut idea supports back to nature philosophy, a romantic idea which gained popularity in the mid 18th century, and it also influenced art, literature, music and architecture. Loggia's rustic cabin is sometimes called the Vitruvian hut because Loggia built on the ideas of nature and divine proportion documented by the ancient Roman architect Marcus Vitruvius. We all know about Vitruvius because we saw in the previous lectures that his trio, famous trio of Italias, Firmitas and Venustas, because of that we know Marcus Vitruvius, and his principles are often derived from nature and divine proportions, which he has documented in his books. Our Loggia's rustic cabin is also called the Vitruvian hut sometimes, based on that idea. Defining the essential elements of architecture is a statement of purpose, a philosophy that drives the work of an artist. Simplicity of design and the use of natural materials, what Loggia believes are architectural essentials, are familiar ideas that have been embraced by even modern architects, including Frank Lloyd Wright. Most of the famous architects, now we are looking at making energy efficient buildings which are using natural elements, natural materials, and uses principles that conforms to nature and which brings in more of nature inside the building so that people will feel more productive. Great architects including Frank Lloyd Wright and many others have used this principle as an essential principle. Here in this slide you see Marcus Vitruvian man, which is made of divine proportions, and this was sketched and drawn by Leonardo da Vinci, and here you see Loggia himself. Next we are going to look at another interesting architect, French architect, Jacques-Germain Soufflot. Jacques-Germain Soufflot was a French architect in the international circle that introduced neoclassicism. His most famous work is the Pantheon in Paris, built from 1755 onwards. It was originally a church dedicated to Saint Genevieve. He was born in Rancy, France. Soufflot traveled to Rome in the early 1730s to study architecture. He returned to France in the late 1730s. This is a sketch and paintings and statues of Jacques-Germain Soufflot. He settled in Lyon and worked there as an architect for more than 15 years. In his design for the extension of Hôtel Dieu, a major hospital in Lyon, Soufflot brought together a variety of styles including classical Roman, Baroque and earlier French architecture. In its decorative motifs, the Hôtel Dieu represents an early statement of the neoclassical style, and it earned the admiration of Marquise de Pompadour, mistress of French King Louis XV. So, this gentleman who goes to Italy, studies architecture there for a period of more than 7-8 years, comes to Lyon and settles, works as an architect for 15 years. He designs a hospital building in Lyon, and with all the things that he has learnt in Italy and whatever that was existing in French architecture so far, he mixed everything and he designed these buildings, and his style was admired by a lot of people, including Madame Marquise de Pompadour, mistress of the French King Louis XV. So, in the 1730s, he attended the French Academy in Rome, where French students in the 1750s would later produce the first full-blown generation of neoclassical designers. Soufflot's models were less the picturesque Baroque being built in modern Rome as much as the picturesque aspects of monuments of antiquity. After returning to France, Soufflot practiced in Lyon, where he built the Hôtel de Dieu, like a chaste riverside street facade interrupted by central former chapel, its quiet dome with an illusionistic diminishing coffers on the interior. With the temple to change, he was entrusted with completely recasting a 16th century market exchange building housing a meeting space housed above a loggia. Soufflot's newly made loggia is an unusually severe arcading tightly bound between flat Doric pilasters with emphatic horizontal lines. He was accepted into the Lyon Academy. A more creative trip to the Italy was made when the mature Soufflot returned in 1750 in the company of the future Marquis de Marigny, the talented young brother of Madame de Pompadour, who was being groomed for his future as director of the king's buildings, the Bâtiments du Roi. The Pantheon is a building in the Latin Quarter of Paris. The Pantheon literally means every god in Greek. So, this gentleman Soufflot was practicing for about 15 years in Lyon, and since he was in the good books of Madame de Pompadour, he had to take the younger brother of Madame de Pompadour to Italy, and it was a more creative trip because this time Soufflot was a much more mature person, and when he came back he designed the Pantheon in Paris. This is how the Pantheon in Paris looks like. Look at the plan: a grand entrance, wide nave, typical Greek cross plan with central dome, and it has 4 other domes on the sides, walls all around. And if you look at the transverse section, you can see the double dome over here, and you can see the magic proportions which he has created. It was originally built as a church dedicated to Saint Genevieve and to house the reliquary chase containing her relics, but after many changes now functions as a secular mausoleum containing the remains of distinguished French citizens. It is an early example of neoclassicism, with a facade modelled on the Pantheon in Rome, surmounted by a dome that owes to some of its character to Donato Bramante's Tempietto. Located in the 5th arrondissement of the Montaigne Saint Genevieve, the Pantheon looks out at all of Paris. Designer Jacques-Germain Soufflot had the intention of combining the lightness and brightness of Gothic cathedral with classical principles, but its role as a mausoleum required the great Gothic windows to be blocked. The most spectacular aspects is the size of the Pantheon. On the ground floor is the form of a cross. It has a length of 110 meters and a breadth of 85 meters. The dome, with its height of 85 meters, inspired the physicist Leon Foucault to carry out his first experiments with the pendulum in the middle of 19th century. He wanted to demonstrate the rotation of Earth on its axis. Quick points about the Pantheon in Paris. It was constructed between the year 1757 and 1791. It is 110 meters long and 85 meters wide. The Pantheon in Paris stands at the height of 83 meters. Its address in Paris is Place du Panthéon. The Pantheon is built of stone and marble. It was developed under the orders of King Louis XV. Pantheon's architect is Jacques-Germain Soufflot along with Guillaume Rondelet. The experiment with Foucault's pendulum was held here in 1851, almost 60 years after it was commissioned. This is how the building looks from the exterior. Nice neoclassic columns with the pediment and the dome, which is said to have belonged to the Tempietto by Donato Bramante. He has taken the dome of the Tempietto and he has tried to put it in this form. Here is the central dome where it's surrounded by domes on all the other sides. This is the front elevation where you can see that it is modeled based on the Pantheon in Rome, whereas the dome is modeled on Tempietto San Pietro. This is one of the first neoclassicist buildings in the world. The construction of the imposing building started in 1757, mainly due to financial problems. It would take 34 years until the project was completed. After Soufflot's death in 1780, his associate Guillaume Rondelet took charge of the project. The building was finished in 1791, in the middle of the French Revolution. The French Revolution was going on when this building was being constructed, when the building was finished. And Soufflot never lived to see the end of this building. He didn't live to see the completed building because he died in 1780 and the building only got completed in 1791, 11 years after his death. Assembly of Revolution decided by decree to transform the church into a temple to accommodate the remains of the great men of France. The building was then adopted by architect Quatremere de Quincy to its new function as a pantheon. In 1806, the building was turned into a church again, but since 1885, Pantheon serves as a civic building. So, the function of the Pantheon kept changing from a church to the civic building on and off. First, it was built as a church, then it was changed to a place where the remains of great men of France could be accommodated. Then at 1806, the building was changed again to church, and now after 1885 it has consistently been a civic building which houses like a mausoleum for great men of France. The floor plan shows a Greek cross layout, 110 meters long by 85 meters wide. The large dome reaches a height of 83 meters. The portico with the large Corinthian columns was modeled after the 2nd century Pantheon in Rome. The dome features 3 superimposed shells, similar to that of the St. Paul's Cathedral in London. Iron reinforcements were added to strengthen the structure even more. Here you can clearly see the drawings which Soufflot made and the building how it looks. This is how the building looked earlier, and this is how it looks today. It's another shot at the interior of the Pantheon. Here is where you can see the double dome with a capsulated top. You can see a section of Pantheon over here. Corinthian columns are the junction where the building is turning. Look at the 3 columns which are placed right next to each other. Pantheon has the statue of Voltaire, a famous French. On the second trip to Italy, Soufflot made a special study of theatres. In 1755, Marigny, the new Director General of Royal Buildings, gave Soufflot architectural control of all the royal buildings in Paris. In the same year, he was admitted to the Royal Academy of Architecture. In 1756, his opera house opened in Lyon. In this lecture, we understood the elements of neoclassicism and the types of neoclassicist architecture. We also understood the main architects who were responsible for the growth and development of neoclassicism, such as Loggia and Soufflot. With this learning, we should be able to answer these questions. What is the difference between structural and romantic neoclassicism? Explain the philosophy of and building style of Loggia with an example. Explain the philosophy and building style of Soufflot with an example. So, I have 2 really great architects who have also been following structural neoclassicism, and we will be looking at those 2 architects in the next lecture. Until then, see you. Thank you.